There we go. Hello, people, and welcome. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes for people to join. Thanks for coming. There's a few more. Hello, people. Thanks for joining us. We're just going to hang on a couple of minutes for people to join. As you can see, we have sign language interpreters who are spotlighted, so hopefully you can see them if you need them. We'll just give it a couple of minutes. Hello, everybody. You're very welcome. We're just going to hang on because people are still joining. We'll start in a couple of minutes. Hello, welcome. We haven't started yet. Okay, shall we start? Okay, welcome to our IDS seminar about disability inclusive disaster risk reduction. My name is Mary Wickenden, but I'm going to hand straight over to Dr. Jorg Weber, who's our chair for today. So over to you, Jorg.
Thank you very much. So I'm not sitting in the room. I hope you can hear me, just to make sure. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, or good morning, good evening, depending where you are at the moment, everyone, and a warm welcome. Today's seminar, one day after the International Day of Persons with Disabilities. So I'm very pleased to see this interest here. Joining us for a conversation on disability, inclusive disaster risk reduction, or like we call it, DIDRR. As many of you know, DIDRR has become an increasingly urgent field of work and research. So disasters are rising in complexity, and their impacts intersect with fields as poverty, exclusion, conflict, forced displacement, and climate change, to just name a few. What Sean, Grech, and I emphasize in the opening chapter of the book that you see here, of the recent edited book, An Introduction to Disability Inclusive Disaster Risk Reduction, Intersecting Terrains, is that persons with disabilities are not a minority issue in this landscape. They constitute roughly 16% of the global population and are often among those living in the most exposed and in the least resource settings in the world. So disasters are not only physical events, they disrupt livelihood, they fragment communities, sometimes families, they deepen inequalities and reverse long-term development gains. So DIDRR asks us to confront all of this directly. This book was our first attempt to map this terrain academically and critically. So to say, to bring together scholars, practitioners, working on disability, working on disasters, working on climate change, on governance, early warning, conflict, migration, and humanitarian action. It pushes us to look a bit beyond technical fixes and consider actually the structural, political, and social forces that shape disaster, vulnerability, and resilience. In fact, one of the reasons that we thought this book was necessary is that although the term disability inclusive disaster risk reduction has been used over the past years increasingly in policy discourses and in practice discourses, it remained largely undefined and somehow like we saw conceptually unsettled. There was a lot of talk, but actually no shared understanding of what DIDRR actually entails. In the book, we therefore set out to give the term some substance. We frame DIDRR as an approach that goes beyond technical accommodation and instead actually centers rights, participation, accessibility, non-discrimination, and not to forget the removal of structural barriers. It is about ensuring that persons with disabilities are active agents in all phases of disaster risk management, prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery, and about recognizing how systemic inequalities create or intensify disaster vulnerability. In other words, DIDRR is not simply an add-on. It is rethinking of disaster governance through a disability inclusive lens. In the first chapter, we lay out why systems continue to fail persons with disabilities, which includes inaccessible early warnings, shelters that turn people away, responders without training, fragmented health systems, discriminatory attitudes, policy gap, even though global frameworks such as the CRPD or the Convention of the Rights for Persons with Disabilities and the Sendai framework explicitly mandate inclusion. It also reminds us that DIDRR is not simply about accommodating needs, it is about participation rights and challenging dominating paradigms both in disaster and in disability. So today we want to explore this terrain a bit further. We will hear 4 contributions that reflect precisely the type of intersectional and practice-grounded work the book calls for. First, we will have Ross Price, that will begin with a scoping study on disability inclusion and distributive climate justice, highlighting how climate impacts exclusion and inequity compound each other. Then we will have Brigitte Rohwerder. She will take us into the complex overlap of natural hazards, violent conflict, and forced migration, and what it means for persons with disabilities. Then we will have Mary Wickenen. She will shift the focus to disabled children in disaster context, one of the least documented yet most affected groups. And we will also have a practice example from Muhammed Atif, joining us from Pakistan and sharing insights from Pakistan on cross-agency collaboration and national strategies for DIDRR. So across these contributions, the purpose today is not only to present findings, but later on also to surface the gaps conceptual, empirical, operational? What do we still not understand? Where does practice lag behind policy? What kind of partnerships, research approaches, institutional changes are actually needed to move beyond aspirational statements? And you all will have possibility to ask questions. You can either do that in the chat or later after all the participants have presented, we will have time to discuss. Again, thank you for being here. I look forward to the presentation and to a rich discussion afterwards. Let me now hand over to our first speaker, which is Ross Price. She's a researcher at the Institute of Development Studies. And please, over to you, Ross.
Thank you, Jorg. Yes, so I'm a researcher at IDS. My background's in climate policy, and I've moved more into climate justice issues. At the beginning of this year, I, along with my colleague Brigitte, who has a background in disability inclusion, decided to do a scoping review looking at the intersection of these issues. And we were particularly interested in people with disabilities' lived experiences and how those are being reflected in the literature. So we did a scoping review, and within that we identified 19 papers that we felt looked at these issues. So within that, today I'm just going to talk about distributional justice, which is one of the tenets of climate justice, but there are other ones that we looked at, but today I'm focusing on this because of the subject matter that we're looking at and the focus of this seminar. So distributive justice, we took a definition adapted from Bell et al. So distributive justice is about fairness and distribution of climate burdens and benefits alongside the material resources needed to cope and adapt. So we kind of grouped findings under different headings, and there were overlaps between these, but the first kind of area that emerged was around the disproportionate impacts. So people with disabilities are more likely to live in poor areas prone to disasters. They're amongst those least able to access emergency support. They face disproportionately higher rates of morbidity and mortality in climate-related disasters. The literature also talked about how climate change exacerbates existing environmental, attitudinal and institutional barriers to, for example, health, food security, housing, water, sanitation, so that they're already facing compared to the general population. And there's also literature around structural barriers and stigma and discrimination, which means people with disabilities generally have fewer resources to recover from climate events and disasters than the general population. So the majority of the studies that we looked at really did focus on this disproportionate impacts of climate change and disasters and this lower resilience of people with disabilities to respond. So the next grouping was around exclusion and access to resources. So the increased climate vulnerability of people with disabilities mainly stems from their exclusion from disaster preparedness and adaptation efforts, as well as persistent underlying patterns of social, economic, and institutional marginalization. People with disabilities face unequal access to resources such as land and asset ownership, social safety net programs, and opportunities for change compared to the wider population, which also contributes to their vulnerability. There is a lack of climate finance targeting people with disabilities. Many organizations of people with disabilities have flagged how they need to be better informed and aware about climate issues and disaster preparedness. And then the next grouping was around inclusion in impacts of climate solutions themselves. So the literature provides a few examples of inclusion of people with disabilities in disaster risk reduction, adaptation programming, and climate solutions. However, so disaster risk reduction and humanitarian practice seems to be ahead of climate change sector in general. in terms of implementing disability inclusive approaches, this progress still remains very limited. And climate adaptation approaches often overlook disability. And evidence of disability inclusive approaches actually happening, or of how the resilience of people with disabilities has been enhanced or not enhanced, maybe it's reduced by climate interventions, remains very limited. So there's very little evidence on that. There may be these things happening on the ground that's then not necessarily being recorded or documented, but there is quite a clear gap in the literature around this. Okay, so that was focused on distributive justice, and these are just some key overall points that we found from our review. So a lot of the literature focuses on how climate change may or is likely to affect people with disabilities, but it includes quite limited empirical data and little evidence based on their lived experiences. Much of the literature has been kind of more aspirational than evidence-based. And there is a need to conduct more research and highlight how people with disabilities mobilize and respond to disasters and their roles as active agents, rather than this merely vulnerable victims of climate change framing, which is still quite prevalent. There's a need to understand people with disabilities and their representative organizations' priority issues around climate justice and climate change. And also bear in mind that they're not a homogenous group themselves. There's many differences and different priorities, and their voices need to be heard. And in particular, in-depth and participatory action research on the intersections of disability and climate change and climate justice is really currently lacking, and this needs to be a focus of research. Thank you. So that was just a quick snapshot.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So that was, you've shown that there's a clear need for more robust studies, actually, how people with disabilities actively respond to and mobilize during climate-related events, rather than portraying them only as vulnerable. And also why conflict sensitivity and disability inclusion must be addressed together within DIDRR. I would like to point to the next speaker, which is Brigitte Rohwerder, is also from the Institute of Development Studies, and over to you, Brigitte.
Thank you. So I'm going to be talking about when people with disabilities are experiencing natural hazard-related disasters during violent conflict, or when they're in forced migration. I'll focus first on what happens in natural hazard-related disasters in violent conflict and forced migration before moving on to what that means for people with disabilities. So of the 19 top 25 most climate vulnerable countries that are at risk of natural hazard-related disasters, 19 of them risks are compounded by fragility, conflict, and violence. And the reason for this is that violent conflict increases all people's vulnerability to the impacts of natural hazard-related disasters. Conflict and forced displacement weaken individual resilience, they weaken coping capacities, and they cause trauma, which can impact on people's ability to flee and impair their decision-making. It disrupts social networks and livelihoods, which makes it harder for people to cope. It can result in forced migration to hazard-prone areas. Conflict also can result in the degradation of environment. It also disrupts and delays humanitarian aid, which people might be using to cope. And it diverts resources away from disaster risk reduction in the affected countries, as there might be a focus on other priorities, and there's also reduced public management capacities and limited disaster risk data that's available. And in some instances, there's also a deliberate use of disaster vulnerability as a means of violence. Together, all this deepens people's vulnerability and increases their exposure to disaster risks. And then specifically within forced displacement contexts, people who are forced displaced are more isolated. They've got, they might have limited language proficiency in their new settings. They might have limited knowledge of the hazards in their destination settings. Where they are living, camps or in urban settlements, are often quite difficult geographic settings. And they face restrictions on their movement, on their livelihoods, which limits their options and coping capacities. So the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is one of the biggest frameworks that set people's approaches to disaster risk reduction, does not mention conflict or fragility. And there's been a failure to systematically consider the effect of conflict in disaster risk reduction contexts. Disaster risk reduction is often viewed as the state responsibilities, but in conflict contexts, they often overlook it due to pressing other needs, or they have maybe a lack of control of the whole territory, and they might not be able or willing to protect all citizens from disaster risks equally. There are various barriers to advancing action on disaster risk reduction in conflict-affected contexts. These include violence and insecurity, which can make it dangerous for people to implement disaster risk reduction programs. There might be manipulation or politicization of information about disaster risks. There might be prioritization of peace and security over disaster risk reduction. And disaster risk reduction actors might lack the capacity or willingness to work in conflict contexts. In addition, there is very limited evidence, practical evidence, on how disaster risk reduction can be implemented in fragile or conflict contexts. Some of the evidence that exists suggests that, okay, maybe in conflict contexts, it can happen in the settings in the country that are a bit more peaceful. And disaster risk reduction has paid little attention to people who are actively on the move as a result of displacement, or what restrictions are placed on them in refugee settings. So turning now to people with disabilities in violent conflict and forced migration settings. Just like Roz noted in relation to climate risks, people with disabilities are disproportionately have a disproportionately negative experience of conflict, forced displacement, and the humanitarian responses to them compared to their non-disabled peers. There's an increased risk of acquired impairments or deterioration of existing impairments due to conflict, due to disruption to the health services in conflict, and so on. Stigma, discrimination, ableism, and poverty weaken people with disabilities' resilience to conflict and forced displacement. And the social exclusion they experience means that they face greater problems dealing with the consequences of conflicts as they start from a position of less resources and weaker support structures. Conflict and forced displacement settings can create additional attitudinal, environmental, communication, and policy barriers for people with disabilities, and they're often forgotten about and deprioritized in conflict settings. And as mentioned before, they're often excluded from the humanitarian response and don't have equal access to the basic services provided, which also weakens their resilience. looking at when natural hazard-related disasters occur in conflict and forced migration settings. The little evidence that exists shows that crises have a compounding effect on people with disabilities, existing disadvantage and exclusion. But there is very little evidence that looks at those experiences. The little that I found was one study that took place in Kenya, which was looking at people living in internally displaced camps who were also experiencing flooding. And so there's a quote from one disaster reduction specialist working in this area who said that a father specifically said that he had become tired of carrying his disabled adult son from one place to another whenever there is a conflict or whenever there's a flood. If it had been an animal, he would have slaughtered it. But because it was his son, he has to carry him around. I carry him, but it's hard to move him. I'm getting older, and it is hard to carry him around. So this compounding effect means that the community and family bonds that help people with disabilities survive disasters are disrupted and damaged. Violent conflict sets people against each other, forced displacement separates them. And the people's loss of assistive devices, healthcare, new or worsened impairments, the unfamiliar environments they're in, reduce people with disabilities, independence, capacity to manage risk, and increases their dependence on other people who are also struggling because they're in these situations. So their disproportionately negative experience of one crisis, such as a conflict, puts them in an even more disadvantaged position at the start of a next crisis, like a natural hazard-related disasters. However, people with disabilities aren't inherently vulnerable. It's as a result of the exclusion and barriers they've been experiencing. And we need to remember that they've got capacities despite this. Finally, looking at disability inclusive disaster risk reduction in violent conflict and forced migration. So just as there's not much information about people's experiences, there's also a lack of information about disability inclusive disaster risk reduction in conflict and forced displacement contexts. So the people who are doing disaster risk reduction in conflict contexts often aren't thinking about people with disabilities experiences. And the people who are doing disability inclusive disaster risk reduction often aren't thinking about the impact of conflict. The few examples that exist aren't very well documented, which is definitely a need going forward. So to finish, disability inclusive disaster risk reduction in violent conflict and forced migration needs to be conflict aware and conflict sensitive because of the politicization that can occur. It needs to be trauma informed. It needs to recognize the capacities of people with disabilities. And also there's clearly a need to document and research the experiences of people with disabilities that are conflict affected and disaster affected, and the experiences of disability inclusive disaster risk reduction in these contexts. And stakeholders across the disability, disaster, climate, conflict, and peace specialisms need to better collaborate with each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Was a very interesting presentation on also bringing attention to how overlapping crisis, violent conflict, forced migration, and natural hazards compound vulnerabilities and disrupt support systems. We're coming to our third speaker, which is Dr. Mary Wickenen. She's also a disability researcher in IDS. with extensive experience working with disabled children and the families in the Global South, using participatory approaches to understand children's lived experience and the barriers they face in education. And I hand over to you, Mary, please.
Thanks, Jorg. Just hang on a sec. Okay, so as Jorg says, I'm a disability researcher at IDS, and my particular passion is doing research with and about disabled children in various different contexts, quite often with them, so finding out how they see the world. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is talk about disabled children as children a little bit, and to think about their status as children, and then talk a bit about how they are taken into account in the various DRR guidances, some of which have been mentioned already by my colleagues. And then I'm going to touch on a couple of the case examples that were included in the book chapter that I wrote in the book that Jorg edited, and then touch a little bit on recommendations, which are a bit similar in some ways to the ones that have already been mentioned. So children with disabilities are a very marginalised group generally, and we know that their marginalisation is often compounded by humanitarian emergencies. So they face lots of barriers anyway, and then in a difficult situation, they often face more barriers. So if we think about children generally, children as a structural group within society have generally in the past been regarded as a vulnerable and powerless group of people. They're obviously physically weaker because they're smaller. They're also regarded as dependent, expected to be dependent, but actually increasingly they are seen as competent citizens with agency who are able to express their views, and children generally are being consulted much more than they ever used to be. And people are beginning, or have in the last 10, 15 years, recognised that they've taken a lot of responsibilities in society, looking after younger children, doing work. And this is recognised now that they are members of society. And they can play important roles within disaster and humanitarian crises, both looking after themselves and knowing how to look after themselves, and also helping to look after others. About 175 million children globally are living in disaster-affected areas, and a significant proportion of those who are injured in disasters are children, because children are around the place all the time. So if we think about children with disabilities, how are they different from or the same as those other children, the rest of children? Because they're part of that group, the bigger group of children, but they're often seen in very othering kind of ways compared with other children. They're seen, unlike other children who are seen as positive contributors to society, they're often seen as a burden, as helpless, as pitiable, sometimes of less value than other children, as not normal. And so they're put in this separate box. However, just like the fact that other children are now being regarded in a more positive and agentive kind of way, so too are disabled children, at least to some extent. Increasingly, there is recognition of their rights as covered by both the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the more recent Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, although arguably disabled children are not mentioned enough in either of those documents. So as part of the CRC, disabled children are not mentioned that much, and in the UN CRPD, the main focus is on adults. But they should be regarded equally and be afforded citizenship, which they quite often are not given. They should be recognised for their contribution or potential contribution to society. But they also need support and safety, education, health, just like any other child. And they need to be recognised as social beings, as part of the community, rather than as some separate kind of people. So disabled children are about 10% of all children, about 250 million children in the world, UNICEF have reported, but they're often invisible citizens, as somebody called Salvatello noted. So some are born with impairments and some acquire impairments later. And as Brigitte mentioned, sometimes they acquire impairments as part of a disaster or a crisis. So children are quite liable to wander about. Maybe they wander about into a landmine field, or they don't understand the dangers around flooding. So they acquire disabilities sometimes during one of these crises. As has already been noted, families with disabled children are usually disproportionately poorer and are socially isolated from their communities very often. So despite needing all these things, the same as every other child, they also have some extra special needs for consideration and assistance. And that's especially the case in disasters. In normal contexts, we've already noticed they're excluded and stigmatized quite often, marginalized and denied opportunities, but this is increased during disaster type situations. They're also all the time, but also more in disaster situations, at increased risk of violence, abuse and neglect. The rates of those in disabled children are up to 4 times the rates for other children, just in normal contexts. So disaster exacerbates all these disadvantages. So they may need extra healthcare, they need rehab, so physio and all those kinds of things, assistive devices like wheelchairs or glasses or hearing aids or crutches or all these kind of things they continue to need during a disaster, and they may need new ones or bigger ones as they grow. They also need adaptations to attend school. Many children with disabilities don't go to school. The proportions can be as high as 80% of disabled children not going to school in some contexts. And they also need to be included in social situations alongside their peers, and that often doesn't happen. So what we're looking for is some intentional inclusion rather than accidental exclusion. We're not particularly saying that they're deliberately excluded in most of the time, but they are accidentally excluded. People aren't thinking about them, so they don't make the provision for them when they're providing for other children in disaster and crisis situations. So that requires a proactive, planned, participatory and inclusive approach across all sectors, whether it's health, education, whatever. So it needs to be intentional, and that's what's often missing. So just a little bit about where children with disabilities are in these key documents. The older documents around DIDRR don't mention children with disabilities specifically, hardly at all. Just a little list, I won't go through them all, but the Sendai framework that's been mentioned already is very generic in relation to disability and doesn't really mention disabled children. The Sphere Handbook, which is also a very key advisory document, lays out the standards that should be applied, and disability is covered, but again, children not very much. Then there is a UN Charter on the inclusion of people with disabilities in humanitarian situations, and that does emphasise children, women and children more. So things are getting better as we move forward. But mostly, none of these documents mention actively seeking the views of children with disabilities or involving them in preparation and planning and mitigation activities, which they do with other children. So other children are prepared for disasters in school, for instance. But if you're a disabled child who's not going to school, then you're going to miss out on all that work that's done by teachers around preparing for a disaster. More recent guidance and noticeably documents by UNICEF at various dates is more comprehensive, as you would expect, because UNICEF is focused on children, and they have done quite a lot around children with disabilities and some sector-specific advice around education and health. So things have improved, and a lot of it is driven by UNICEF. That includes things like producing accessible materials that are suitable for children, adapting documents and advice so that it's got pictures and easy read, literacy, because a lot of disabled children may be illiterate because they haven't gone to school, adapted communication formats so that disabled children understand what the risks are and what they can do to protect themselves. So, but basically lack of recognition of children with disabilities and oversight of them is a major barrier. They're just kind of left out quite often. So in the chapter in the book, which I wrote jointly with 2 colleagues from Humanity Inclusion, which is one of the big INGOs, disability INGOs. A couple of examples. There's a nice example of a boy called John, who's a Somali boy who has autism, and he was not being included in school in a very positive kind of way. So HI, Humanity Inclusion, did some work with the teachers to promote positive support of that boy so that he was more included in school, and they made some adjustments to the school regime so that he was actually included rather than just sitting there but not being part of what was going on. Making physical environments more accessible. So often emergency schools in camps or disaster situations quite often are really not very physically accessible or adapted at all. So the playground and the buildings themselves and the toilets can all be very inaccessible for all except the most able children, if you like, physically able children. So they can be rocky and have uneven paths and no ramps. Lots of overcrowding in the classrooms with, say, up to 100 children in a class, no space for a wheelchair or somebody who has a walking frame. So HI have done some good work on trying to adapt schools so that they are really accessible. And then lots of awareness raising work needs to happen, both with other children in the classroom so that they are not discriminatory and bullying of children who have disabilities. So the example in the book is about two girls who were given glasses, and then they're teased by the other children in the class who are slightly jealous of them being given this resource, and they don't understand that they need the glasses in order to see the blackboard. So there was work with the teachers so that the teachers could model inclusive attitudes. But you also need to do that work with parents and with the community so that everyone understands disability and understands that we need to prevent stigma and bullying. There are a couple more examples in the chapter as well. So children with disabilities can become active participants in their own lives and in their families if there's an inclusive approach, which encourages them to participate and join in with decision-making, involves them in the preparation and mitigation activities that other children are involved with. So this was a nice quote from a girl in Bangladesh who was included in a very inclusive program, and it had changed her life, really. I feel I can fly like a bird. I can play with children. And before I was scared to dream. So, the idea that a child will feel very isolated unless some very proactive things are done to make sure that they can be included. So I've got a list of recommendations here, which again come from the book. Let me see how am I doing with time. Jorg, are you going to start shouting at me? Let me see. Oh, I can't see the time. So a number of recommendations about parents of disabled children and making sure they have the specific support that they need, recognition of the extra resources that they need, because they may have other children, but they may feel that the extra time and expense they have for the disabled child, they just can't stretch to unless they're given extra support. Emergency schools in different settings need to be automatically disability inclusive and welcoming so that children in those refugee camps or humanitarian crisis camps do get included and that those schools are equipped to welcome those children. Healthcare facilities, ditto, they need to be disability inclusive and child friendly. Quite often they're disability inclusive for the adults, but nobody's thought about making sure they're welcoming for children, so that children can also access the general healthcare needs they have and their impairment needs. Child friendly related services, making sure that they can get, obviously children grow over time, so you can't give them a wheelchair for life. They need a bigger wheelchair every few years. They need different hearing aids every few years. They need different size crutches every few years. So their needs are evolving over time. Wash facilities, water and sanitation facilities also need to be child friendly as well as disability friendly. So because that could be very scary, a great big long drop toilet without any guardrails around it is a bit of a scary thing for a child. They think they could just fall into that pit. So you need physical guidelines to get into the toilet. You need an accessible door and preferably without a step, ramps, signage, all these kinds of things. Use of child-friendly language, supported by pictures and symbols for children who don't understand very well or can't read and write. Gender is particularly important because disabled girls are generally more discriminated against and excluded than disabled boys. A regular pattern that we see is disabled boys getting to go to school and disabled girls not going to school. And also we need privacy and protection for girls because they're at risk of abuse and sexual violence. So, and then a whole list of people who need disability awareness and child-friendly training to counter discrimination. child-friendly spaces. A lot of emergency situations, refugee camps and similar, have a disability focal point, very often run by an NGO, but these need to be child-friendly as well as disability-friendly. They may be very focused on adults and not so focused on children. And we need to make sure that disabled children's perspectives are sought alongside other children. So asking them what they think, asking them for their ideas, alongside other children or sometimes specifically for them. Okay, so the key message would be that disabled children are equal citizens and that we need to listen to what they have to say. People don't think of even asking them, but if you do ask them, it can be quite surprising what they tell you. They have a pretty good idea of what they need. And we can ask them about DIDRR contexts. They can be involved in planning and response and mitigation, just as other children can. Okay, thanks. So Jorg, I hope I wasn't too much over your timing.
No, thank you very much. I just wanted to come in. You just finished it. Thank you very much. But you showed us powerfully how children with disability already facing exclusion in everyday life become even more marginalized and at risk during disasters. And you highlighted the urgent need to recognize them, as you saw in your last picture, as equal citizens, ensure access to information, to education and protection, and actually bring their voices into every stage of DIDRR. Thank you very much for that. Finally, we welcome Muhammed Atif, who is Executive Director of the Special Talent Exchange Program STEP in Pakistan and a leading practitioner in disability, inclusive humanitarian action and DIDRR. Before you start, please, can you quickly introduce yourself, and I pass over to you to Pakistan.
Thank you very much, Jorg. And I was supposed to be in that room today in person, but now today I'm speaking some few thousand miles from Sussex, from Pakistan. And I'm representing an organization run by people with disabilities, STEP, Special Talent Exchange Program, which is working for the last 27 years in Pakistan and South Asia. So we are working very closely with international development organizations, with UN agencies, with organizations of people with disabilities at the grassroots level, and we have been working very in collaboration with the government departments to ensure disability inclusion in all the spheres of development, in all the sectors of development. Today, particularly, I will build on what has been said by previous speakers, that people with disabilities are the most marginalized people in any disaster or effect of climate change or any kind of forced migrations, and which we have personally experienced here in few mega disasters happened in Pakistan, India, Nepal, and Bangladesh particularly. And we have been working with the people with disabilities directly on the war zones in the Afghanistan border and some other parts of Kashmir. So what we have learned, that people with disabilities were not part of the decision-making process in disaster management planning. And that was a major cause that they were left out in all the disaster or the emergency responses. Most recently, Government of Pakistan owned authority, the National Disaster Management Authority, has launched their strategy for aligned with the Sendai framework on DIDRR. The strategy is basically focused on early warning systems, and they have made all the early warning systems totally disability inclusive in terms of accessibility of communication. It was launched 2 weeks ago. And just before that, a few months ago, in collaboration with UNESCAP, we have developed our e-learning platform on disability inclusive DIDRR. That was a training module which was attended by all the staff of National Disaster Management Authority and their provincial officers. That was mandatory for them, and they have attended the course. That was a 1.5 hour course. After that, they were like they've got a little understanding of the disability from a human rights perspective, and they have got an understanding why disability is critically important to address in the disaster management plannings. So that these are the two big things which happened recently in Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh. But it took a lot of effort. Like it was not that simple that it happened after some lobbying or negotiations. It includes a lot of experience of the disability rights movement in the country, in the region. In 2005, after the earthquake, we first time realized that people with disabilities were last to rescued. They remained unattended in their rubbles, and we were contacted by some people with disabilities who we know each other in the disaster affected areas, in the earthquake affected areas, that we haven't been reached yet. So then we realized that there should be some mechanism. We established an information and resource center in the emergency phase and collected data of people with disabilities and communicated that data to Red Cross and other humanitarian organizations who were reaching there from all over the world. And that practice of establishing that information resource center for emergency response for people with disabilities was quoted by one of the issue of Oxford Journal of Forced Migration. I can give the reference later on. So then after a few years, we have seen a flood, devastating flood which was like covered 30% of the country and in other neighboring countries, similar magnitude. And that after that flood, we have seen some little stories like people were carrying their cattle, animals, or their luggage or important things from their homes, and they left people with disabilities behind alone at their homes during the flood because they were not able to carry them. And they think they are useless, so how can we carry and how far we can carry them? That was very unfortunate. And we met those people with disabilities and recorded their comments, and we compiled that kind of some case studies which we shared with National Disaster Management Authority, but there was no response. We attended almost all the meetings of your agencies were happening on the emergency response at that time. So then we realized that we need to be organized. Then we formed in 2010, we formed Aging and Disability Task Force. I'm actually sharing my real experiences as a practitioner here because we have seen some academic research and we have seen very good findings. So these kind of experiences are really important to contribute to learn from these exercises or these practices and can contribute at the policy level. So we formed that Aging and Disability Task Force. Many leading organizations like CBM, HI, Site Savers, they were part of the formation and the founding members. And there were 10 OPDs from across the country, and particularly from the areas where the flood was high at that level. So this Aging and Disability Task Force formulated some guidelines for the emergency response and visited all those areas somehow through their partners, through their humanitarian organizations, and raised the voice at all levels in the emergency response and then in the rehabilitation phase. As a result, we have seen that a large number of people with disabilities were seen in the data collected from the affected areas. And that was a big achievement for us that at least people with disabilities were counted. Later on, we worked with UNHCR and to make all the emergency response and other emergency the early warning system disability inclusive, and we formulated some practical guidelines for the humanitarian organizations. And then we realized that not only people with disabilities, older people and the minorities, some of the religious minorities who are living in the silos or living on the margins of society, they were also excluded. So we renamed this task force as Aging, Disability and Diversity Task Force, and which is still functional and working and have been replicated in some of the Arabian countries and in South Asia. So this kind of task force helped trained humanitarian organizations, their staff on disability understanding. But still, like we have seen that people with disabilities are still excluded. We have policy, but we don't have any law and legislation which ensures Actually, the policies are without jaws. So we need some kind of legislation which can ensure the protection of people with disabilities in the climate change effects or disasters, which is not being taken seriously, I would say, as yet. And the reason is again that people with disabilities are on the not on the table of decision makers. They are not visible in the decision making corridors. So that is the whole direction of our effort that we are putting together, that people with disabilities are consulted. As Mary has mentioned, that children with disabilities need to be consulted what they need actually. Same is the case with people with disabilities, because disability is not a homogeneous group. They are diversified. They are heterogeneous. They have all all of them have a unique kind of experiences, and we have practically seen that after the land variant, after the impact of climate change, most of the people with disabilities lost their support system. Many of them lost their livelihood opportunities because they were having some kind of livelihood connections with the land on the river, but now they have lost, and most of them were begging when we visited them. So we need to consider that what people with disabilities actually need and how we can include them in the DRR planning. That was the call. Now, just for a last example, which I would like to share, that we have implemented a project in collaboration with CBN and Maltese International in one of the most flood-prone area in Pakistan. We selected two areas. One was the flood-prone area at the riverside, another was in the mountainous terrain. So we selected these two areas and we formed an organized group of people with disabilities in those villages and asked them to plan their own hazard mapping in an accessible way or in a way they used to live in their communities. Then we introduced a buddy system and with people with disability, because in these areas we can't even think of facilities like accessibility or the assistive devices. They're all dependent on their neighborhood or the family members. The social protection schemes are very limited, and even at some places they don't exist at all. So, in that kind of areas where the accessibility is totally missing, people with disabilities are mostly confined in their own houses, and rarely people know them each other. So, we can establish a buddy system so that in case of disaster, some people in their neighborhood can inform them that there is a disaster or any announcement for the evacuation, or they can assist them, or they can have some kind of spare wheelchairs or accessory devices so that they can evacuate. As a result, we have seen some of the schools which were being used as shelters, they became accessible for people with disabilities, and some sign language interpreters were found, but which was surprising for us because still the sign language is not standardized. So every local community have their own sign language or adaptations. So we have seen some sign language interpreters from the local community. We have seen some accessibility in the shelter points. So these are the examples which can be used as footprints or for the policymakers or to scale up the ideas. But I would recommend to consult people with disabilities for DRR planning, and this is the right time if we include them. Otherwise, in coming years, the impact of climate change will be devastating. And if we not include people with disabilities at this stage, they will lose their lives. There's a fear. So as George mentioned, that they are around 16% of the population. If we assume that the largest minority of them live in the South Asian region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Muhammad, and it was great to hear your very practical insights from Pakistan and beyond on cross-agency collaboration and community-level disability, inclusive DRR, showing how policy change, how training, how OPD engagement actually come together in real-world settings. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of our speakers for these rich and thought-provoking contributions. What we have heard today spans quite multiple terrains, from climate justice to conflict or displacements, to childhood to governance and practice, and they together show actually how complex and interconnected the field of DIR truly is. So it's a very complex field. And they also remind us that while we have strong policy commitment on paper, there are still many gaps in, like we heard from the first speaker, in evidence, in research. There are many gaps in participation. There are even more gaps in resourcing based on the first two gaps. And of course, there are many gaps remaining in implementation. And this makes spaces like today essential. So now I would like to open the floor for questions, for discussion. Please feel free to raise questions, or if you want to share reflections from your own work, or also to challenge our assumptions here, the speaker's assumptions. The aim here is not only to clarify points, but also maybe to deepen a little bit our collective understanding. So I'm looking forward. Feel free to raise your hand or to post a comment in the comment sections. The floor is open.
And one in the room, Jorg.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
A quick question, and thanks very much for all the presenters. It was really, enlightening and thought-provoking presentations. Because I saw quite a few images of UN agencies and SPEAR guidelines. All of those were mentioned. So, are we just trying to convince these UN bodies to adapt some of these things in DIDRR, or we are also interested in our government joining some of these initiatives?
Muhammed, you want to respond? Please go ahead.
Yes, I can respond to this question as I asked that very rightly, that we have seen a lot of contribution of UN agencies. Actually, UN agencies are the first to reach the disaster affected areas. And yes, as I mentioned, that now the governments, as we have seen in Nepal, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, the NDMA has adopted the UN strategies on disability inclusive DRR. So governments are adapting, but there's a lack of understanding on the implementation. So, and because these are the human emergency response policies, so in case of emergencies, they think that everybody is same. So they forget to collect data of people with disabilities affected by the disaster. But yes, we admit that policies are there.
Thank you very much.
I've got one here.
Yes.
Just to add to that, I think the difficulty for governments is that they're always short of cash, aren't they? They've got so many things they've got to spend money on. So there's a temptation for them to say, oh, that's not our priority at the moment. And my answer to that would be, well, why are disabled people always at the back of the queue? They should be in the queue. You can't keep saying, well, we'll do that when we've done everything else. So we need to push back on that argument that it's a luxury to think about disability. It should be an inclusive approach, needs to be part of everything that's going on. But we have yet to convince a lot of governments of that. Even if they've signed the UNCRPD, they haven't really integrated that into everything they do. They think, oh, that again, you want us to do inclusive health now, or we're only just getting on top of health anyway, or whatever. So I think we need to really push that idea that it's not an added extra, it's something that should be integral.
And natural hazard-related disasters happen anywhere in the world, including countries where UN organizations don't operate. So governments of high-income countries really need to be thinking about it too, yeah.
and maybe if the chair is allowed to contribute to the response. No, we are not just there to convince you in bodies. I mean, the UN bodies, they write great frameworks, but it's basically the communities that have to actually do the work at the end. So DIDRR ultimately lives and dies at the level of governments, at the level of local authorities, and at the level of communities. UN agencies provide the global norms like SENDE and CRPD and so, but the real change actually happens when states adopt these commitments, resource them, like Mary said, and implement them through inclusive systems that actually do reach the people. And even beyond government, we need OPDs, we need civil society, we need service providers, we need communities to be active agents. So the aim is not one target, it's a whole ecosystem that basically must move together. Otherwise, DIDRR doesn't work.
Hiya, thanks very much for the really insightful presentation. So it's clear from this presentation that within disaster risk reduction frameworks, disability inclusion isn't mentioned enough. It was also mentioned that disability is not homogeneous. So how within these frameworks can you improve the recognition of what is a diverse, like the diversity of lived experience within the label of disability? So how can you make these universal frameworks more inclusive?
Who's going to tackle that one? I mean, I'll say something to start with. I mean, I think the universal symbol for disability is a person in a wheelchair, and that has been very successful in some ways because it's recognised all around the world. So if you see a picture of that symbol, you know it means a disability accessible toilet or other building, whichever. It's also done the community a disservice in the sense that it reinforces that idea that it's all about physical impairments and physical difficulties. It doesn't represent the wide diversity of people who have deafness or visual impairment or psychosocial difficulties or mental health difficulties or cognitive difficulties, you know, and there are lots of invisible types of impairment or not so clearly visible as physical disability is, that we need to raise awareness about. And we probably need to do that with all the above mentioned agencies that Atif listed and Jorg listed. So somehow we need to make sure it's not a homogenous kind of picture, which just makes people think of the wheelchair symbol. But I don't know what other people have to add on that.
I see Muhammed is raising his hand. Please go ahead.
Yeah, as far as the universal document, global commitment is concerned, actually, there is no need to focus on the diversity of the disabilities. There is a need to focus on the diversity of needs, the enabling environment. If the society is inclusive, if the assistive devices are provided, the environment is accessible for everyone, and the communication is accessible, that means the inclusion is ensured. When people with diversified disabilities are addressed. But we need to, these instruments need to focus on the ensuring that enabling environment is created. So that should be the approach. Then we can include everyone in living in the same community.
And I think too, if you have a diversity of people with disabilities involved in implementation, which is that next step on from policy, you get a better idea of the diversity of need, which was mentioned. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I hope this answered your question. I think that was somebody in the room. I'm speaking from Germany now, so it's a little bit difficult to understand who responded, but I hope that a response made you happy for the moment. If there's any, I see a nodding, I like that from Kai. That is good. And is there any other question in the room or outside the room?
We have more people online than we have in the room, so I wonder if any of those are thinking of something to ask.
Just a quick question on data and evidence, because it came up quite a lot, and Rocio mentioned you looked at 19 studies, right? So I was wondering whether they are all from kind of academic kind of papers or more broad, somewhat called grey literature as well.
Well, with the scoping study, it went broad. It went to some great. We originally looked at academic, but there were not that many, and so we went broader, especially because we wanted to see if they had this lived experience, and so we were wondering if more practitioner-based literature would include those sort of perspectives. But it was really found across the different types of literature, it's the same gaps existed. Yeah, do you?
Yeah, and I think like there's more going on than is documented. And the depth of what is going on also isn't well documented. So people might mention they're doing this or they're doing that, but they don't detail like how they're doing it, what the impact's been. So it's much harder for people to then learn from other spaces. But the people who are mainly doing that, the documentation that exists tend to be in the grey literature rather than the academic literature. Yeah, possibly. I mean, I think it's, but it's also what, I don't know, I think it would be useful to everyone if that is better documented.
Yeah.
But that's a resourcing issue then too, because you're doing, and then sometimes that it's harder then to write about it. That's not your priority. Your priority is the doing.
Maybe it's not just a resourcing issue, it's also an issue of will sometimes. Just to so that the lack of data is not a mystery. It's the result of systems that basically were never designed to see persons with disabilities. That's at the very bottom of it. And DRR surveys, there are DRR surveys, but they don't disaggregate. Governments often avoid counting when they don't prioritize. And crises make invisible groups even harder to reach. That we had it in examples before. So collecting good data is difficult, yes, but the bigger issue, this is my opinion, is political will. If you don't look for people, you won't find them. That is what we often see. So still encouraging. If there are any questions, please come forward. Or how do you say, please stay silent forever? Something like that. No, it's a different wording in English, I think. But I don't maybe please don't perceive me as rude. Just if I were now in Brighton, I would try to advertise an apple pie for the next question, but I can't offer you that. But it's also fine if there is no further question. Then we probably can conclude. Again, before I give back to Mary, thank you very much for this really insightful presentations. I think that were a start for further discussion, and we should leave the discussion open and going, because the topic is too important to be left out. We all watch the news with more or less pain, with more pain these days probably, and we know that this issue is, as the issues we were talking about, they're becoming more and more urgent and more forefront, and we will need more of this rather than less. So looking for more of this, and thanks, and giving back to Brighton.
Okay, I don't have much more to say. Thank you very much, Jorg, for a lovely chairing role. That was great. And thanks especially to the sign language interpreters. I'm not quite sure whether anyone was in need of you, but it was great to have you there. And thanks to everybody else for attending online and in the room. A small but perfectly formed audience, I think. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.